Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. Today we have with us a very special guest, Professor Gabriel Rockhill. Professor Rockhill is a French-American philosopher, writer, cultural critic, and activist. He is professor of philosophy at Villanova University and the director of the Critical Theory Workshop. This show is in fact a joint collaboration between India and Global Left and Critical Theory Workshop. There is a YouTube platform of Critical Theory Workshop, which all of you should check out. Professor Rockhill, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure.
We want to start right away with the encampments or sit-in protests across the United States. More than 100 colleges have participated in these sit-ins or encampment protests. The core demand is to force administration of universities to sell off investment from Israeli companies or holding any portfolio that are related to businesses as usual with Israel. This is also following months and months of divestment campaigns by organized labor. We did a show with Professor Jeff Sharkey, labor historian and labor journalist, on how he thinks this is a massive rupture in American history because it is almost for the first time US organized labor has come out in open protest against investment of their pension funds and union funds in Israeli infrastructures and other investment companies. And I think this sort of coordination between labor and student was epitomized yesterday on the May Day rally in New York City, where thousands and thousands of workers and students came together, including unions like UAW endorsing that, which is a big thing, not just because of its size, but also its involvement with the defense industrial complex. Benjamin Netanyahu says that these protests are horrific. He has got full coverage in US corporate media and also British media. And he has linked these protests with that of Nazi mobilization in Germany in the 1930s. President Biden, the New York Times just reported, has condemned the protests as anti-Semitic and chaotic. This is following 2,000 arrests over the last 2 weeks, according to a report by the New York Times. You have been involved at the grassroots. What are your impressions? And tell us about how the media has covered these protests.
Well, I think that the first thing to say is that the basic model of US-style empire building has been to try to shore up hegemonic consensus within the imperial core, and in particular within the professional managerial class stratum, whose job it is, amongst other things, to kind of manage the minds of the masses. And that this imperial consensus in the core is what allows them then to continue their imperialism abroad, but with a kind of an ability to act unhindered by the kind of class formations on the home front, and to pretend that they are the purveyors of democracy and human rights and whatnot. This kind of system of indoctrination, though, has been very difficult to maintain at certain moments in time, and this is certainly one of them. So we have months of a live stream genocide, which the US has systematically supported. We have major mobilizations, as you mentioned, within labor and as well within the student movement and the kind of broader organizing movement in general. And this has led to a situation that is obviously a PR nightmare for the empire. And it has had a very powerful radicalizing force on young people, bringing many of them into organized political resistance to varying degrees, more or less for the first time, depending on the case. And so I think it's a very exciting and very interesting moment in the kind of conjuncture that we find ourselves in, where the US empire is trying to exert and not only its power in the world, but also to rejuvenate itself in the kind of phase of neoliberal crisis that it finds itself in. I do think it's important, and this is more specifically speaking to the student mobilization, that we have to have learned, or I hope a lot of people have learned from the Occupy movement or the Occupy ICE movement, there are extreme limitations to horizontalist modes of organizing, to occupations, to encampments and things like this. And so what we really need to both be thinking about right now and doing is building the organizational structures that are necessary for us to fight and win in the medium term and in the long term. And so that's one of the immediate concerns. But regarding your immediate question, I've been at many of the encampments, and they're absolutely peaceful in spite of the fact that there's constant attempts on the part of Zionists or various agents provocateurs to destabilize the encampments. So at the University of Pennsylvania, there were Zionists who came with knives. There was someone who came and sprayed what appeared to be pesticide all over. There are other people who have come and played loud music. Meanwhile, the encampment has remained peaceful, steadfast, well organized. And so the media, of course, is marching in lockstep with the imperial interests of the capitalist ruling class. One of the clearest cases in this regard, and I'll leave it at this, is what happened at UCLA, right? Where you had basically Zionist militants who were allowed to act with impunity on the part of the police, beating up and roughing up protesters, and the police then backing that up, who themselves, the protesters that is, or the encampers themselves, were being nonviolent and primarily trying to simply defend themselves. And then you have outlets like the New York Times or NPR saying things like clashes broke out, no one's sure who instigated them, and basically finding ways of massaging the message to communicate to people that somehow it is those who are protesting genocide that are the source of violence. In this regard, it's very hard for the US media machine to keep a lid on all of this simply because it's so outrageous, the contradiction between the violence of genocide on the one hand and the clear nonviolence of those protesting genocide on the other.
One of my friends at the University of Chicago, he has been organizing in these encampments, and he's from India basically, and he also participated in these massive student protests in 2020 prior to the COVID in India that merged with the protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act, which basically tried to turn Muslims, Indian Muslims, into second-class citizens.
Right.
And one of the things he told me was very interesting. He said that he never felt as insecure within these encampments because of the heavy presence of, as you said, the parallel sort of Zionist organizations, but also massive police mobilization alongside.
Yeah.
I mean, he says that there are drones, helicopters flying all over the student campuses, which are like unthinkable in most of the global south. While we think that America is this heartland of democracy, it's such a police state, which a lot of people already knew, but it is revealed to a much broader elite audience, let's say. I think this is a good segue into something that I think you have been working on, a book project about ways of understanding larger capitalist mechanism of propaganda. I think in a recent interview published in the Monthly Review, you called the US empire a veritable empire of spectacles. Um, Tell us what this veritable empires of spectacle is, and why is it important to understand the nature of US empire?
Well, the US, when it emerged as the leading imperialist force in the wake of World War II, right? If you take World War I and World War II as basically a long-term struggle between imperialist rivals, the US had a specific way of doing that. And that is that it, on the one hand, ran what is ultimately a veritable fascist international. I mean, they recruited Nazis and fascists from Italy and fascists from Japan, and then integrated them into a kind of international architecture for fighting the war against communism and for the spread of capitalism by any means necessary. But at the same time, it ran both internally and internationally a cover campaign for all of this through their culture industries by presenting themselves as the grand defeater, those who defeated Nazism, those who have fought fascism, are spreading democracy, bringing human rights, and all of this. And so I think it's really this twofold aspect of US empire building that needs to be seen. is that it's an empire that largely says that it's not one. And that's part of its power, is that the war for the hearts and minds, both domestically and internationally, is absolutely essential to the way in which this empire building process has functioned. And it has allowed the US to, as I mentioned in my opening comments, shore up, at least to some extent, a consensus within the professional managerial class stratum within the imperial core, many of whom actually do think that the US is generally a force of good in the world and not a dominant empire that is simply driving to expand its imperial reach, spread capitalism, and beat back any socialist alternatives. I think that in that regard, in analyzing the society of the spectacle that's been generated in the US case, it's really important to mine down into the core aspects of it, right? And see the system as a total system. That includes, obviously, the structures of ownership in the media, the fact that basically we have monopoly capital that controls the majority of what everybody sees and hears. The mindscape, not only of the US citizenry, but there's a cultural imperialism that's operative, so it's also blasted all over the broader world, but that this media complex or these culture industries also work hand in glove with the bourgeois state. And that there's not really, I mean, at certain levels, there are distinctions between the private and the public realm, but the way in which the US state operates is that a large part of its intelligence services work in propaganda. That's their principal function. Ralph McGehee, who spent 25 years in the CIA, said it very clearly. He said that the principal function of the CIA is to produce disinformation. And William Casey, who headed the CIA beginning in 1981, I believe, said very clearly that our job, we know, will be complete when everything the American public thinks is wrong, right? So the bourgeois state functions hand in glove with these culture industries and with the internationalization of these culture industries in order to pump out as much as possible an image of the United States that inverts reality. And it has an awesome power never before seen in humanity, right? We've never had such a developed capitalist and imperialist system with such developed culture industries, so much so that that has also had a very pernicious effect on the left intelligentsia, on what's referred to as Western Marxism. I mean, these are people who read the New York Times and they read the Guardian and they read outlets of the bourgeois press that themselves work hand in glove with the intelligence agencies, the Western intelligence agencies. And so it's an enormous problem that I think if we're interested in struggling against this spectacle, we both have to understand it and then find ways of building power against it.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you actually mean by culture industry? I mean, do you mean academic journals or Hollywood industries or the New York Times? I mean, what exactly is the culture industry?
Yeah, the culture industry is a product of the bourgeois cultural apparatus. So by bourgeois cultural apparatus, I simply mean the entire system of production, circulation, and consumption of culture. And I know that this is quite abstract, but I really think that we have to see that entire system. It's not simple individual newspapers or book publishers or universities. It's a systematic framework that is driven by the capitalist base because those are the funders. That's how this cultural apparatus emerges. It's ultimately kind of part of the superstructure. So it includes things like the newspapers and the mainstream press, but it also includes universities, the entire system of knowledge production that goes into universities, the think tanks, the NGO world for that matter. All of this needs to be seen as a system that manages the production, circulation, and consumption of knowledge. Now, in my own research, I'm interested in this whole system, but obviously it's quite capacious. So I'm focusing more specifically on the Western intelligentsia. And therefore, a lot of my focus concerns the academic world, but also the journalistic world because there's so much overlap, as well as the cultural world of writers and artists who are participating in this. And the struggle to control this cultural apparatus and to use it as a weapon of soft power is absolutely at the heart of US empire building. I don't know how many, I've done a lot of archival research, Freedom of Information Act requests. I see again and again and again internal documents, intelligence documents from the intelligence services of the Western countries that say the most important war is the war for hearts and minds. And this is a complex war that operates at different levels because it's at once trying to indoctrinate people, but it's also then trying to provide cover for the moments in time at which, well, indoctrination is no longer possible, so we'll just use repressive violence in order to eliminate our enemies, but we need to run cover for our own repression. So we need disinformation for those purposes as well. It's a really central aspect of US-style empire building that is different than some, many empires have used these forms, but the specificity of the way in which it operates in the contemporary context in the US is quite different than what we've seen before. And I think we need a lot more research that unveils how exactly it operates.
I want to come to the broader question about the intelligentsia and how that is complicit in manufacturing this consent. But I want to sort of, clear our way by asking you to give us a few instances of the US deep state in its complicity. I'm thinking about the Defense Department or the CIA. How has it been complicit in this project of manufacturing consent for the empire or for the larger capitalist empire, if you like?
Yeah, I think just one quick note on that is that often when people hear the term CIA or intelligence services, they really have almost immediately this vision of the world in which there's a system of marionettes and there are intellectuals who have strings attached to them, and then the CIA puppeteers are just manipulating what they're doing. That's not how this system works, and it's not how solid materialist analysis should elucidate that system. This is how Hollywood, that works with the State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency, tells us that these intelligence agencies operate. So it's actually a propagandistic version of how things actually function, which is not to say that, in certain instances, there are intellectuals who have received direct payment in order to do certain things. But in general, how this operates is that the Central Intelligence Agency, along with other agencies and the capitalist ruling class, has taken control of and already had control of the marionette theater. And then the marionettes come of their own accord, and you don't need strings attached. So those who are acting within those institutions operate in such a way that they can often, or they can at times at least, be unwitting, meaning they're not knowledgeable of the way in which the marionette theater was constructed and who is actually calling the shots. In that regard, then, that's just a quick note. There are many, many examples of this. One, I think, that is very important is that what's referred to as the big three, the foundations of Ford, Rockefeller, and Carnegie, these are, the foundations are simply cutouts from the capitalist ruling class, and it's a way for them to embezzle their money and to try to whitewash what it is that they're doing through so-called philanthropy. But basically, it's a form of cultural class warfare. That's what foundations do. They leverage their stolen wealth from workers in order to then wage a war against those workers on the cultural front. And Rockefeller played a crucial role in the immediate post-war era. Ford took over a lot of that. Actually, today, Mellon is doing a lot of that same work. But they're all partners in this. And there is an enormous porosity between the big three and, for that matter, 4 or 5, because there are other foundations, and the Central Intelligence Agency and the intelligence agencies. The Church Committee unveiled this in 1975, but this is an ongoing story. The capitalist ruling class and the bourgeois state work hand in hand. Don't believe what they tell you, that somehow these are separate. So the Rockefeller Foundation, for instance, supported it's called the Lazarsfeld Office of Radio Research, that was set up at Princeton in order to do research into the impact of radio onto the general audience. It was basically investigating how propaganda worked and how it could be improved. And those funds were some of the funds that were used to basically bring someone like Theodor Adorno, one of the founders of the Frankfurt School, over to the United States. The Rockefeller Foundation funded Horkheimer's first trip to Germany, which took place in April 1948, after he was exiled in the US and was returning to Germany. And they then, I think, assisted him in setting up a professorship at Frankfurt. The US government itself actually paid an enormous amount of money, it would be the equivalent of over $1 million today to take the Frankfurt School that had relocated to the United States and move it back to West Germany and use it basically as a, uh, an intellectual production center for Western forms of Marxism that were hostile to actually existing socialism and that drew extensively on American models of empirical research. Those are just a few quick examples, but there are many, many more in things that I've published in my own research, but then also a number of forthcoming pieces that I have. And so I could talk more about specific examples, or if you want to know particular cases, the Ford Foundation was funded in 1966. The famous arrival of French theory in the United States was funded by the Ford Foundation. And they very clearly made decisions to make sure that the people who are identified with French theory were the non-Marxists, the non-communists. Even Althusser, who later would be integrated into the Western Marxist canon, was not part of the famous conference where there was Derrida and Lacan and Deleuze was invited, Foucault was invited. It kind of launched French theory within the Western world and particularly within the United States. And then they also funded a whole series of follow-up conferences and things like this, because what they wanted to do was to have a form of quote unquote radical theory, or they even funded, the Rockefellers funded what they called the Marxist-Leninist Project. And that is the precise term that they used, because they wanted to fund and support forms of theoretical production that were perhaps knowledgeable of Marxism and even Marxism-Leninism, but took strong positions against them. So one way of putting this, just to conclude, is that what the capitalist ruling class and their bourgeois state managers generally supported was socialism, meaning compatible left socialism. It could be social democratic, it could be anarchist, it could be liberal, libertarian, etc., over and against communism, by which they understood actually existing socialism. And what they wanted to do, and I think succeeded at least in certain sectors, was drive a wedge within the left between the socialists and the communists, and then denigrate and try to neutralize the hard left or the actually existing socialist left in favor of supporting and promoting the kind of what is now the radical liberal left, and at that point in time was more kind of social democratic left, if you will.
Yeah, I think this is very helpful because I think there are two things going on here and they're interlinked. And even the article that we are referring to, that was your interview in the monthly review, you give us a lot of examples where those are direct cases of US deep state spreading out some information, handing out to the New York Times or to the media, or so that's one set of manufacturing consent, if you like, spreading out misinformation, like saying Iraq is developing nuclear weapons, right? Just handing them out to corporate media and then they involve in the propaganda. So that's one set of very direct kind of manufacturing consent. And then I think the bigger story is what you are saying is not necessarily the CIA or the deep state kind of manufactures in its own level in its own laboratory, but it amplifies kind of development that probably goes on, in the larger world. So I'm thinking about the French theory, and tell us a little bit about the French theory and its emergence. Did it emerge out of a section of French intelligentsia's own disillusionment with whether theoretical Marxism or the larger project of communism in Soviet Union, and trying to find an alternative to that, or whether it emerged out of some France-American deep state kind of, manufacturing an alternative and imposing it on the larger world?
Yeah, this is a really great question. If you'll allow me, I would just like to speak a little bit about the kind of methodological aspects of my work to elucidate how I come to this issue, because it's an issue that's so central, because I think some people have a misunderstanding of what it is that I'm trying to do. And a lot of that misunderstanding has to do with bourgeois ideology and the way in which bourgeois ideology opposes the absolute freedom of the individual on the one hand and these determinist structures on the other. right? So the idea would be that, well, the individuals aren't free because the CIA is the puppet master and they're just controlling everything behind the scenes and there's this deep, dark conspiracy or whatnot. That's not what I'm saying at all. Never said it, never would, doesn't make any sense. And what doesn't really make sense, though, is the bourgeois ideological framing. So my methodological approach is dialectical and it's materialist. And what I mean by that is that I'm always approaching things in terms of the different forms of agency that are operative, right? Individuals have agency, so do institutions, so do states, so do the kind of material forces of economics. All of those are different forms of agency. And that what we need to do is do a materialist analysis that is fine-grained enough that we can see all the different forces that are operative and situate those forces within a system of elucidation so that we not only understand individual cases, but we can extrapolate from those individual cases and see the overall framework that produces those individual cases. So in relationship to something like the French theory, it is not the case that the Central Intelligence Agency just decided to bankroll, some radical theoretical production that was anti-communist. There is an organic development within the French intellectual scene that was aided and assisted by the rise of the modern capitalist press in the wake of World War II, increased readership, a baby boom generation, a radical student movement, and things like this. This was all part of this broader context. In fact, the 1966 bestsellers that Lacan and Michel Foucault published, right? This was prior to or almost sequential with the moment in time at which the US empire then began kind of promoting French theory. So there was an organic emergence of basically a kind of anti-communist theory within the French intellectual context that was driven largely by a kind of petty bourgeois radicalism that rejected socialism and actually existing and the Communist Party as basically in terms that were identical to the ideological orientation of the US State Department. So the communists are totalitarian, they are orthodox, they don't think for themselves, they're controlled by this big brother apparatus, there's no internal debate, all of these kind of stereotypical myths. And the French theories, what's that?
Reductionist.
Exactly, reductionist, teleological, yeah, all of that. And the French theorists themselves, just as we were saying a moment ago, they largely relied on the bourgeois press and the bourgeois imperial institutions they were trained within in order to garner an understanding of actually existing socialism. There is not a single case of all of at least the major French theorists. There are a few exceptions for like second or third tier versions of this, but people like Derrida, Foucault, Lacan, there's not a single case of any of them who seriously studied actually existing socialism or really knew much of anything about something outside of the French and Western European context. Granted, Foucault lived in Poland for a little while and just denigrated it and stayed afar and things like this, but he never really studied it in any serious manner. It was only anecdotal and personal information. And so their versions of actually existing socialism were largely dependent on the forms of Western Sovietology, which, unbeknownst to them, because they didn't do this type of research, they weren't interested in this type of relationship between knowledge and power. Western Sovietology is largely a product of the intelligence industries. This has been very well documented, and I'm going to document it in even greater detail in the book that I'm finishing. But the major figures in Western Sovietology largely worked hand in glove with MI6, CIA, and other intelligence agencies. And it's the same thing with the bourgeois press. And so what you have is a very uninformed and ignorant rejection of actually existing socialism, combined with petty bourgeois radicalism and perhaps most importantly, opportunism. Because French theory in the immediate French context, French professors don't make as much, particularly in the post-war era, as US professors or even British professors do. I mean, mainly US professors. And so
even though they might have a great status, they might have a great cultural status in France.
Oh, they do. Exactly. Yeah. The symbolic capital they have a lot of. But as far as, hard capital, the way to get that is to play to empire. And that's what they did. In fact, they competed with one another to develop the most refined and sophisticated metaphors for the Cold War, in which you have difference, which is a stand-in for basically freedom of experimentation and all of this over and against sameness and totalizing thinking, which is basically a metaphorical stand-in for Hegel, Marx, and the totalitarian universe that they're rejecting. And they profited handsomely from that, right? I don't have it readily available, but some of the salaries that these people received from the UC schools, from NYU, they had money, shared aplenty with them because they were producing the type of work that served the interests of empire. And that money came from multiple sources. Some of it was foundation money. Some of it was National Endowment of Humanities. And so it was state money. Some of it was just university money that was leveraged because these are large corporations who are in the business of imperial knowledge production. And so it's that larger complex set of relations that we need to see in order to understand why this particular form of theory was promoted, while at the same time, the forms of theory that they were rejecting were demoted and were attacked and were repressed.
I think I want to ask you to talk a little bit about a couple of figures that you can choose for yourself so that our viewers can have a concrete sense of who we are talking about, and tell us a little bit about what their ideas were in terms of their attitude to existing socialist systems or capitalism as such, or NATO and the US empire, so that our viewers can actually get a sense of who we are talking about. And then we will come to their frameworks, the larger discourse frameworks, or what they had to offer.
Yeah, I'm mainly focusing on what I consider to be the kind of foundational traditions of Western, quote unquote, radical theory. So the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, French theory that we were just talking about, the New York intellectuals to some degree, and the kind of British intellectual scene. And then there's a lot of spin-offs with kind of Operismo in Italy and other figures or Žižek for that matter. But this kind of conglomeration of the leading luminaries of the theory industry. And what is quite remarkable, because I don't know if people are aware of this, but this is how I was trained, right? I spent decades studying this work. I did my master's with Jacques Derrida. I did my PhD with Badiou. I worked with Balibar. I worked with Rancière. So this is where I came from. And so my diagnosis is not an external one. It's an internal one. But it's not an immanent critique because I don't want to stay within that system. I want to understand it from within, but then also from outside and how it was produced. And so what is remarkable is that across these traditions, there's almost a constant consensus. And that constant consensus, and I'll give you a few concrete examples, is that actually existing socialism is absolutely horrific and is to be condemned in every way, shape, and form. There's not even saying, well, Cuba will support, but the Soviet Union's bad, or maybe a little bit of China. There was a flirtation with China, of course, within the French theoretical scene for a few years, and then that was shut down very, very quickly. And there's still that with Badiou. There's a moment in the, Maoist cultural revolution that he supports for very specific reasons that I also find quite reactionary for reasons that I could explain in a longer discussion. But overall, there's a rejection of actually existing socialism. Foucault himself says everything, right? The guy who never studied actually existing socialism, doesn't have the language skills, doesn't have the interest in doing so, says everything in socialism is to be condemned, right? People like Adorno and Horkheimer basically said the exact same thing. They vilified the Soviet Union and Chinese communists, saying that they were slaves who preferred fascism. And they equated communism with fascism, just like the US State Department, or elements in the US State Department, because actually the US State Department even was more sophisticated because they had there were different teams pushing in different directions. And Marcuse, who worked for the US State Department for years, was actually against the totalitarian thesis and for détente. So it was just one kind of element within the State Department. Adorno and Horkheimer were basically aligning themselves on the more right-wing elements of the US State Department.
Tell us a little bit about Marcuse, because he seems to be a little bit different from Adorno, Horkheimer, who are very directly pro-US, pro-NATO in many cases, or even their analysis of capitalism has nothing to do with economic structures or materialist structures. They focus a lot on bourgeois art, bourgeois, and even their analysis of jazz music and everything has been challenged by black radical intellectuals and so on and so forth. Tell us a little, but Marcuse seems to be engaging a little bit with Soviet Union, even though his research is not, up to the mark of, let's say, I would say even Maurice Dove, who engaged with economic production and a lot of data that he produced insofar as the Soviet Union was concerned. But he seems to be engaging with the
Definitely.
Soviet Union. So tell us a little bit about him and his differences.
Yeah, there's a chapter in my book that I'm actually writing right now on this, and we're fortunately, and I will do actually a webinar with the critical theory workshop with this author, Tim Mueller, I believe his name is, wrote I think it's 750-page book in German, and it's the first time that someone's gone through the complete archive and revealed what Marcuse was up to. And it's fascinating and information that needs to be more widely known within the Anglophone world, because there's been debate for years about, well, Marcuse didn't work for the State Department, but yet he was Angela Davis's, mentor and all of this. So Marcuse spent 9 years working for the OSS, the predecessor organization of the CIA, and the US State Department, and he was not a small figure. He was the head of the intelligence branch for the US State Department, research and analysis branch of the US State Department for Central Europe. And he was considered by the State Department to be one of, if not the leading specialist on communism. He spoke and read Russian. And so he did engage very seriously with the Soviet Union, but the work he was doing was for the US State Department. And he also collaborated with the Marxist-Leninist project that Rockefeller was running. And then when he left the State Department, he went to two CIA cutouts, the Russian Institute at Columbia and the Russian Institute at Harvard, and where he continued to work with all of the state operatives that he'd been collaborating with in Washington, because they all went there and were working in these cutouts. Later in life, right, around the kind of the mid to late 60s, he went through a process of radicalization. That process of radicalization meant that he didn't become a Marxist. He very explicitly, even at the there are some later texts where he's very clear about this. He says, "I'm not a communist. I reject communism," etc. He instead embraced the idea that, well, there's the workers, we can't rely on them for making a revolution. The socialist states like the Soviet Union are basically, they're just forms of industrial society, and they're akin to industrial societies and capitalism. And so the only hope really is a kind of radical youth rebellion that he affiliated with the Great Refusal that could be allied by kind of racialized struggles within the imperial core or third world struggles. But a lot of this amounted to a kind of petty bourgeois radicalism that rejected very clearly any forms of political organization that are those forms of political organization that had proven themselves to be the ones that could fight and win in the anti-imperialist struggle. He did, and in all of my work, I try to do a variegated analysis. We don't just take one individual and throw them entirely under the bus. We've got to look at their various different positions. So fortunately, he was against the war in Vietnam and took out, he didn't support the communist struggle for anti-colonial liberation, but he was against the US imperial presence there. And that's very different than Adorno and Horkheimer, right? Horkheimer said that this was a war basically for human rights, and that that's what the United States does, which is, of course, a level of profound ignorance that you'd only find in the mind of someone who's beholden to what he called the purveyors of a shackling society, who was paying for the work that he was doing. So he was just basically doing his job. So Marcuse is a kind of complex figure, but I am not of the group of people who think that, well, there's a truly radical Marcuse who broke with his earlier State Department orientation. And that's what I'm going to try to chart out in this chapter, but I don't think I can go into all of the details right now.
I think I wanted to ask you also about Hannah Arendt and Foucault a little bit, because you um, you have used the word collaborationist with Hannah Arendt. Um, I don't agree with her chapter on Bolshevism in Origins of Totalitarianism, but I found her first part of the book very well founded, where she basically goes through the history of the Jewish history and history of anti-Semitism and its link with the absolute states, and how the collapse of these states eventually blow up versions of anti-Semitism and so on. A lot of people find her commentary on or her critique of Zionism in Israel after 1945 to be very helpful. Her writings on immigration and so on. What do you mean when you say she is a collaborationist? Are you talking about her being funded? Do you mean she is uh, completely misguided in terms of her understanding of what the Soviet Union was, which I think was the case, by the way. But what do you mean exactly?
So Arendt, like Marcuse, had an intellectual trajectory. And the first parts of the Origins of Totalitarianism have quite a bit of a different tenor to some
Right.
of the later chapters. And that's for very specific historical reasons, one of which is that she received support from the British Foreign Office, which the Foreign Office is where MI6 and the intelligence agencies that deal with international relations and foreign policy are housed. And so she was part of a network of intellectuals that were in Great Britain supported by the bourgeois state on the condition, of course, that they were doing the type of work that they wanted to have done and that they promoted. And she also was, at least once, it might be more than this, I'd have to look at my research notes, she indulged in the Rockefeller Foundation has a famous villa in Switzerland where they kind of invite intellectuals to just spend time and produce their work. This is basically providing incredible material conditions where people can produce ideology. She indulged willingly in that and was part of the New York intellectual scene in which, and Arendt's complicated, right? She was related to the American Congress for Cultural Freedom, did do some work with them, and I found some correspondence in which she's implicated within, and this was a CIA cutout, right? But at the same time, she was somewhat critical of some of the leaders of that, particularly Sidney Hook. Sidney Hook himself was contracting with the CIA and was part of this whole network that she was in. And she was critical of his more kind of vociferous anti-communism at times. So I think that Arendt she collaborated with the Foreign Office in Great Britain. She was part of an anti-Marxist kind of ideological campaign, particularly in some of her later work. She completely misrepresented the entire history of revolutions. And in fact, in the German edition of her book on revolution, justified slavery. Slavery was justified as the material conditions by which you could then produce politics as the right or as the activity by which people could get together and discuss the political issues of the day. You needed labor to be taken care of. And so the slaves they were basically the foundation for politics. And also just completely misrepresented. I mean, she takes Tocqueville's kind of interpretation and runs with it of the French Revolution and of the 19th century more generally. And so I think a lot of her work is historically just profoundly misguided. In fact, Eric Hobsbawm, the Trotskyist historian from Great Britain, referred to her book on revolution. He said, I'm sorry, that her book on the best description of her book on revolution is that what astronomers are to astrologists, real historians of revolution are to what Arendt has produced in this work. So basically saying it's like astrology. She's just superstitious thinking. And I think that's a correct description of that book. But again, I agree that we need a variegated analysis. I mean, her position on race relations in the United States, I think, is absolutely despicable. So I don't know if that helps. She wasn't one of the quintessential operators, right? Someone like Raymond Aron, the French intellectual who rivaled Sartre, he went on vacation with the CIA officers. He was really in the heart of matters. Arendt was in these circles, supported the basic orientation, particularly as the Cold War progressed, not as much early on. So she was a collaborationist, but at a level and a degree that was more minor than those who are really in the kind of heart of the beast, if you will. In the case of Foucault, since you mentioned him, Foucault,
Yeah,
both in his writings that I mentioned, condemned socialism and all of that, but then he was also directly involved in the exact same types of campaigns that US and Western intelligence services were running against the Eastern Bloc. He was fundraising for Solidarność. Solidarność itself was a complex movement, but early on, Solidarność in Poland was calling for a reform within communism. And then quite quickly, it became a kind of petty bourgeois revisionist movement that was allied with and funded by the Central Intelligence Agency and other, sources from the West. And Foucault was not only directly aligned on that agenda, but then oversaw he was part of the secretariat for an organization in France that was based on solidarity with Solidarność, and CIA money almost certainly came through those conduits. And then he himself brought materials to Poland and then endlessly spoke out about it in a public setting. In fact, his principal political investment, other than his statements on Iran, for the latter part of his life, it was all supporting the dissident culture in the East and calling for the end of colonialism in Europe. And what he meant by that is the end of the Warsaw Pact countries to be reintegrated into Europe, reintegrated into the capitalist world. And the vocabulary that he uses, I outline this in my book, if you compare it to the Reagan doctrine and statements from the national security state of the United States, it's almost verbatim identical. So the positions that he was taking and the things that he was doing was precisely what they wanted to have done. Was he directly in the pay of the CIA? I've never seen any evidence to that. And again, it's a matter of a variegated analysis that looks at the different levels of complicity, right?
Yeah, I think this is what I was basically getting at. I mean, there is one level of complicity which is very, very direct. Then there is another level of complicity which is you are aware of where the fundings are coming, what's the larger project, and you are still participating in that. And then there can be another level of which I wouldn't say a complicity, but a complete misunderstanding of what reality is. I mean, I see a lot of people around me who say I support Ukraine because they are not aware of the basic facts of what NATO is and how the US is actually propping up this wars, forcing basically. So, and I think we have to, I'm not accusing you, but I think it's always good to have these sort of nuances in our analysis. I think I have other questions, but to wrap up this segment, I think just to talk a little bit about the frameworks that they offered. Some of the frameworks, it seems, uh, have been helpful to many including in the global south, but you can talk a little bit about why the French theories became so popular within the US, within race theories and so on and so forth. But I am also thinking of the global south, where a lot of ideas of Foucault, whether it's about his monologue, his massive 3 volumes work on sexualities is considered very, very helpful by many queer activists and scholars that I know of. A lot of people who are critique of modernity in the global south also find Foucault's critique of modernity very helpful. Talking about Hannah Arendt, a lot of people find works like Banality of Evil and her critique of Zionism helpful. So what's your response to a lot of people saying that some of these works are actually helpful, never mind their complicity, actual material complicity with empire and capitalism, but the frameworks that they offer are helpful to understand the world? What's your response to that?
Well, I think that we have to look at this from a systemic vantage point and recognize that there is a form of intellectual imperialism such that these figures' work has been promoted globally as the most important, sophisticated, radical, developed, etc. And that requires then a really essential question. Would the imperialist intellectual apparatus willingly promote work that is not in its best interest? Would it promote, for instance, the work of Lenin and Che and Sankara and Fidel Castro? Or would it instead try to, and in certain cases successfully, kill those people and eliminate them? And instead prop up figures whose work serves their interest, right? If you are a star within the imperial theory industry, it means that you are doing something that merits you being promoted as a star. And we have to see this as a system, not simply in terms of individual cases. Does that mean that then everything that every one of these intellectuals has produced needs to be condemned and we should start burning books or something along those lines? No, not at all. I think one of the themes, and I really appreciate the fact that you're teasing this out, of our discussion is the refinement of dialectical analysis. Dialectical analysis, among many other things, means that you always look at the different dimensions and the different levels that are operative and all of the different relations, right? So, for instance, Foucault, I think, is a very, at least at times, sometimes he's obscure, but he's a very good writer. He has rhetorical flair. He's able to conceptualize at interesting levels. Someone like Pierre Bourdieu has a concept of the habitus, which I think is quite powerful and should be recuperated and integrated within a Marxist understanding of the kind of dispositional and embodied aspects of ideology. So there are elements within bourgeois intellectual production that I think can be of use in various ways. And it also makes sense because these are intellectuals who, unlike most intellectuals in the global South, or many intellectuals who are just against actually existing capitalism, these are intellectuals who are given the best material conditions for intellectual production, right? They basically don't have to work. All that they have to do is, they don't have to teach, they don't have to hustle, they don't need a side hustle. They've got research assistants, they've got endless money, they can travel the world, they can publish wherever they want. These are ideal conditions. And under those conditions, it would make sense, hopefully, that bourgeois intellectuals would produce something that might be of interest or of use at certain levels. And so I think that from my vantage point, what's important is that their theoretical practice is primarily invested in exchange value. They're playing to empire. They're developing idiosyncratic conceptual vocabularies and intellectual brands that allow them to elevate their status within the imperial theory industry. They are not producing knowledge grounded first and foremost in use value for the human collective that is trying to change the world, like Lenin, Walter Rodney, and some of the figures I mentioned earlier were. Therefore, there is a strong incompatibility between those two. But again, we might be able to find certain elements. I do not think, and this is a strong position that I take against a lot of Western Marxists, that eclecticism somehow improves Marxism. That Marxism and a little bit of Foucaultianism or Lacanianism or other versions of that would somehow help. I've gone through many, many instances, or Freudian psychoanalysis for that matter, and you don't advance a collective scientific project by mixing it with ideology. What you do is you pervert its fundamental substance. And so I don't know if that helps kind of tease out my positions on this, which at one and the same time are very clear and oppositional towards the exchange value theoretical practice that drives the imperial theory industry, while also recognizing that, of course, there can be certain elements that one might want to then use, draw on. But I think one should be careful and do it in a very vigilant manner.
I think the most interesting thing about the exchange value of the production of their theory, the interesting thing is that unlike, let's say, the neoclassical economic industry, which is very transparent in saying that, we want to enrich the capitalist blocks, they have a very, very transparent, we don't care about inequality, we care about economic growth, and it doesn't matter. We want, the realm of finance capital to prevail. We actually don't want sticky wage, what they say, basically, that labor doesn't need any bargaining capacity. In the case of the theory industry that we are talking about, the interesting thing is that they posited as radical anti-imperialist. So they posited as if their theory is based on use value and not exchange value. So whether it's about the prison system, whether it's about gender sexuality, whether it's about critiquing of empire in its discourse forms, the presentation is that these are radical alternatives, and I think that is one of the reasons what makes it more interesting than, let's say, the neoclassical framework or critiquing the neoclassical framework.
That's a good point, because and I point this out in the book that I'm finishing, is that I'm focused very specifically on one sector of intellectual production within the imperial core that I refer to as the radical recuperators. And I'll say more about that in just one second. But it is true that the larger intellectual field is dominated by the true stars of the Imperial Academy, are people like Samuel Huntington, who is basically a national security state operative, Francis Fukuyama, the same, right? The careers of these two gentlemen speaks volumes about how the system works. National security state and university, hand in glove, producing ideology and promoted as bestsellers by all of the assets, meaning the media assets of the bourgeois state. So that is enormously powerful and arguably the kind of driving core, if you will, of imperial academic production, just like the kind of neoliberal economic orientation that you were referring to. And that's a very important part of all of this story. I decided, though, to focus on this sector because the radical recuperators are part of an attempt to drive a wedge in the left and shore up what's called the compatible or the respectable left, meaning those who accommodate capitalism and imperialism over and against the anti-capitalist and the truly anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist left, the materialist left. And in that regard, they are branded, they brand themselves, they market themselves as radical, as revolutionaries, as even communists, etc. That is all part of a branding campaign in order to market themselves as the most radical option available. And they foreclose, they do not read, they do not engage with, they do not cite, unless it's to condemn them kind of in passing, many of the figures who I was just talking about a moment ago, people like Walter Rodney or Che for that matter, or others. You know, there are some exceptions to that. Žižek and Badiou will engage with these figures in various ways, but they're both hostile to actually existing socialism in any way, shape, and form, except for a few years of the Cultural Revolution. And Žižek himself played a direct hand in dismantling socialism and brags about it regularly in Yugoslavia, and was the lead political columnist for a dissident journal that the Yugoslav Communist Party accused in an enormous dossier of being a central intelligence agency platform. Right? This is what these figures do. They radically posture as the alternative to the mainstream while trying to recuperate any insurgent forces within society, young people, intellectuals, workers, everybody, within the mainstream consensus, which at a minimum rejects actually existing socialism and ideally will accommodate capitalism and imperialism. Hart and Negri, I should also mention, they're like the superstars of this agenda. The whole Empire trilogy is absolutely 100% this. And it's important, I think, for us to see what that is and what its social function is, precisely because it's so pernicious, right? The way I came to Marxism being trained within the Western world is by reading people like this and thinking, well, this is the most radical alternative possible. And there was nothing outside of that, because anything outside of that was this totalitarian hellscape with blood running in the streets and all of this. And what's the takeaway from the radical recuperators, right? Where is the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist revolution that was led by Hart and Negri and people of their ilk? It is nowhere to be seen. What their intellectual project consists in is petty bourgeois radicalism that drives their own agenda as opportunists within the empire. And they need to be identified as such, called out as such, so that we can clearly demarcate forms of theoretical practice that are contributing to the collective project of hopefully improving the world and stopping it from, endless wars and environmental degradation, etc., versus this form of theoretical practice that is hoodwinking people into performing radicality through their consumer choices and not having them get involved in organized politics to build power for a better world.
There is a claim that post-structuralist theorists in particular, following Derrida and others, that they pushed Marxism to be more aware of the assumptions that Marxism had in its categories. What's your response to that?
Well, first of all, there's not a single post-structuralist that I've read who actually knows the Marxist tradition. They all misrepresented in the most embarrassing manners possible. Yeah, and I could point to individual texts in that regard. What they've attempted to do is present themselves as more sophisticated and more advanced, right, than these boors in the periphery who don't have the level of intellectual refinement that you find in the imperial core. This agenda is, in my opinion, pernicious to no end, because what it really misrepresents is the fact that the most refined discourse and mode of analysis that we have, at least in my opinion, is Marxism. And their modes of analysis are crass, reductivist, teleological, simplifying, Manichaean. All of the criticisms that they marshal against Marxism are just simple forms of projection and ideological inversion. And I try to demonstrate this in the book that I'm finishing. I know I'm kind of saying this just off the cuff, but I think that it's very, very clear. Lenin's understanding of dialectics, for instance, is that dialectics is a form of many-sided knowledge that is constantly increasing to try to adapt itself to a world that is constantly changing and constantly shifting. Refinement, precision, conjunctural analysis is the lifeblood of the intellectual work within the Marxist tradition. It has nothing whatsoever to do with economic reductivism, with simplistic teleology, with all of these things that people have claimed. It is, on the contrary, I mean, of course, within Lenin and the broader Marxist tradition, you have endless criticisms of economism, economic reductionism, and things like this. The other thing that I would note in that regard is that French post-structuralism and French theory more generally was integrated within the US-American field and its imperial extensions in such a way that it provided a kind of intellectual patina to identity politics. So another claim that goes hand in hand with this is, well, Marxism is class reductionist and it never thought about race, it never thought about gender, it never thought about sexuality. It is just based on the needs of the white male industrial worker in Europe. And this is benighted to an extent that I almost don't know where to begin, because in the history of the world, almost anyone who has engaged with the actually existing history of Marxism and socialism has recognized that it is the principal struggle for anti-colonial, anti-imperialist liberation. It has been stalwartly dedicated to women's liberation. I mean, Lenin said you can't make a revolution without women, and this is also in practice, not just in theory, of course. And it's not to say that there aren't forms of social chauvinism, forms of retrogression within certain Marxist traditions, but the most advanced forms of Marxist scholarship and activism have really been at the forefront of the struggle. Is not only, and I would recommend Domenico Losordo's Class Struggle if your viewers and listeners haven't read it. The struggle is not only for a transformation of the socioeconomic system, it's also for alleviation from oppression. We want the peoples who have been racialized and oppressed because they are subjugated and super exploited by empire to be liberated economically and to be recognized as full human beings, to be given dignity. This is an absolutely central core. It's Marxist humanism, not in the Trotskyist sense, but in the universalist, kind of Leninist original sense of that term. And it's absolutely central and has nothing whatsoever to do with the identity politics that is also just providing cover for imperialism and trying to drive us away from class analysis.
I like the framing or the use of the category radical recuperator, not just as a form of polemics, but to isolate or distinguish them from a whole range of other Western scholars that you referred to, but we can also think of others. And I think my sort of last question on this segment is um, you've talked about the radical recuperators. You have also briefly alluded to the more overt Huntington types, Western imperialist. We don't have to talk about the far right anyway. I think you and I think they are not part of your research agenda, but I'm just interested in your thoughts about Western Marxists who didn't denigrated Marxism per se. Some of them were very invested in the Soviet project. I'm thinking about English Marxists like Eric Hobsbawm. I'm also thinking about people like E.P. Thompson, who were not as favorable to the Soviet Union as Hobsbawm, but nevertheless they remained firm with Marxism. And these class of people, Perry Anderson and others, they are also quite popular in the global South. Uh, it's no wonder actually people like Huntington and others are actually not popular in the global South, because there is no resonance. I mean there is a very recent trend that some of them would be used by corporate media figures, but they are actually not big figures. The big figures are like people like Foucault on one hand, and then Western Marxist on the other hand, and obviously the tradition of Soviet Union from Lenin onwards are also very, very popular in the global South. I just wonder your thoughts about Western Marxists of the British variety that I mentioned to you.
Yeah, there again, a dialectical and variegated analysis requires us to be somewhat specific about this, because in the case of someone like Hobsbawm, I think is a little bit different than Thompson, and Anderson as well is takes his own actually quite strong positions against actually existing socialism. And Anderson is, I think, a quintessential Western Marxist in the more precise sense of a Marxist who thinks that Marxism basically exists in the mind, and that actually existing socialism is an aberration that should be condemned across the board. He's taken those positions quite forcefully. And E.P. Thompson as well. So there's a very strong kind of Trotskyist orientation that you get within British Marxism.
So would
And
you club, just to be clear, would you club the Trotskyists and the English Marxists of the kind that we are discussing with the radical recuperators? Because I think they're very different in terms of uh, their promotion or rejection of Marxism per se. We are not talking about their position on Soviet Union, but Marxism as a theory.
yeah,
I feel that they are very different. But what you are saying is that they are kind of the one and the same.
well, my version of this is that within this segment of the radical recuperators, there are very different positions, right? So Žižek is a reactionary who's made apologies for fascism and NATO and Europe and imperialism on the one hand. So that's kind of the extreme right of the radical recuperators, if you will. And I wouldn't be surprised if the guy just went totally off the deep end. I mean, he already kind of has, in my opinion. But there's also a kind of left fringe of those radical recuperators. And there are elements, like we were saying earlier, I think that the notion of habitus in Bourdieu, even though Bourdieu was a social democrat who was anti-communist, there are ways in which he articulated a discourse that can be helpful or that we could draw on. In the case of the Trotskyists, for instance, within Great Britain, they are often very good readers of Marx. They draw on Marxist forms of analysis. They have done their own analyses that can be helpful at certain levels and to particular degrees, much more so than those who are just kind of knee-jerk radical recuperators who don't know what materialist analysis is. And that's what I'd say about someone like Žižek.
And a lot of them were historians, unlike just
exactly,
mere theorists.
Exactly. So they were invested in materialist analysis. That said, I think there's a big difference between a doctor who can diagnose a disease, like the disease of capitalism, describe it in great detail, etc., and a doctor who identifies the cure to that disease. And one of the problems within certain sectors, and I wouldn't say all of, because again, the British intelligentsia is also complex, but certain sectors of the British intelligentsia do a pretty good job of diagnosing some of the problems within capitalism, but they take very what I consider to be, I mean, their positions on actually existing socialism are more or less identical to the US State Department. Alex Kalinikos would be another example of this. Anderson, I would put in this camp. And so there again, if we look at the radical recuperators, they're on the left side of this, and hence there's probably more that we could learn from them, draw on from them. I think Hobsbawm is a pretty incredible historian, but I also think he made enormous mistakes, and some of the way in which he framed even just world politics were incorrect. But in doing materialist analysis, we have to draw on different sources in different ways. And for me, definitely there is a way in which some of that British intelligentsia is part of the radical recuperator framework. I actually co-authored an introduction to Domenico Losordo's Western Marxism. It's finally coming out in English with Monthly Review Press in August. And I co-authored it with Jennifer Ponce de Leon, and we look specifically at the case of Perry Anderson and his positions on Western Marxism, his descriptions of Western Marxism. And it is a flagrant case of, in my opinion, a completely false description of the struggle for actually existing socialism in the modern world, where he says basically that there is no case whatsoever, particularly in the two books that he wrote on Western Marxism. And so when you have intellectuals like this who have enormous platforms, right? This is Verso Books, this is the kind of the new left in general. This new left, and it's also in the US, you'd have people like Nancy Fraser, the Jacobin crew, the people who work and are sometimes interviewed on Democracy Now! Like, this is the left that the Central Intelligence Agency was very directly supporting in the 1950s and 1960s. It was the compatible left that was often social democratic, Trotskyist, self-declared Marxist, self-declared communist in certain cases, but they meant by communism, communism of the mind, not communism of practice. And so in our day and age, that framework has changed to some extent because of the successes in shoring up the imperial theory industry. So the intelligence agencies don't have to be directly involved in a lot of this stuff because there's institutional inertia and it functions more or less on its own. But we all know, hopefully, that Verso Books has been a real impediment to publishing certain works by Domenico Losordo because they slander him very incorrectly as a kind of orthodox Stalinist, and clearly haven't understood his book on Stalin, which is not an orthodox Stalinist book. It's an attempt to do a dialectical and variegated analysis that people might disagree with at various levels, but is unbelievably erudite and draws particularly on bourgeois historians of communism in order to develop a version of Stalin that's very, very different than the slandered versions that you get. And so I do see them as occupying the kind of left fringe of the radical recuperators. But they're also people who hopefully are people that we could recuperate for an alternative project because they're trained Marxists, they're very intelligent, they have ample resources, they have enormous platforms. I mean, imagine if tomorrow Nancy Fraser came out and said that she was in support of actually existing socialism. She has a big platform, and that would be an enormous coup for people who actually support socialism, not of the mind, but socialism in the real world. That would be great. And so I would welcome all of them into our camp if they want to break with the kind of the fundamental barrier that keeps them within, in my opinion, the camp of the imperial theory industry.
I think I'm moving towards the end. What should we do because I think as I listen to you with, great excitement and, not just solidarity, but also, I'm learning a lot. I'm thinking about how to create the sort of, the counter space. And I'm thinking about not organizing as much, although that's the most important thing. But my question to you is more on what middle class like us can do in terms of reinforcing the existing struggles on the ground. We had Chris Hedges on our show, and he said one of the problems we are facing with the digitized world is that while we people are commenting, we are providing important commentary, but the reportings are actually done by corporate media. So it's essentially every morning I open the Financial Times. I mean, that's the first thing I do. Then I move to the New York Times, and even within the left spectrum, it's ultimately Democracy Now! That I first look up at, and then Jacobin and Verso Books, right? And then once a week or once a month, you look at the sort of actual what you can call the people-centered journals or magazines that so you have been invested in this project of critical literacy, critical theory workshop, and so on. What do you think we should do?
Well, I think the first question regarding knowledge production is ownership. And so if we are regularly consulting those platforms that are owned by the capitalist ruling class, then obviously we should know how that impacts the content. And of course, I also consult venues like the Times or Democracy Now! Or things like this, because I want to stay up on the way in which the bourgeois press, it also has all of the resources, right? So if
Yeah,
you want to be sending journalists
the
around.
information itself, right? You can't pump the information if you don't have resources, and they have the resources.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's a big part of it. What's the Mark Twain quote? It says something like, if you don't read the news, you're not informed. And if you read the news, you're poorly informed. Right. So I do consult those types of sources, but at the same time, I think that there needs to be, and I think that we're both invested in this in various ways and many others as well, as cultural and intellectual producers, there is what I would refer to as a kind of strategy of, or I should say it's an approach in which there are two tactics in one strategy. So the tactics are the following, at least for me. One is that as intellectual and cultural producers, we can use the tactic that I refer to as a Trojan horse tactic. You can use a slightly different language in order to smuggle messages into the bourgeois cultural apparatus. So you don't talk in certain ways, you change your vocabulary, you talk about social justice and things like this, and you can get messages that are very strong messages into mainstream outlets. But there are conditions for that. The advantage is you get an enormous following, or you can, but the disadvantage is you have to sacrifice exactly what it is that you're saying, right? The second tactic is building up an alternative cultural apparatus, meaning an alternative system of knowledge production, knowledge circulation, and knowledge consumption. That's what the critical theory workshop is all about. And I think you're doing very similar work, more maybe pitching to a kind of journalistic, broader readership. I'm more an academic, but in any case, it's the same type of project that's overlapping in various ways. Who owns the means of communication? Zoom, YouTube, etc. We should have no illusions about that. These are corporations that when they want, they could pull the plug in a second, right? So we have to be vigilant about that. And in an ideal world, we would have ownership over these various digital platforms. And that leads me to the overall strategy. If we want to get to where we need to be, we need a socialist cultural apparatus, not an imperial and capitalist cultural apparatus. And fortunately, there is work that is being done within various types of socialist or self-declared socialist countries that is contributing to this, right? So when I wake up every morning, I watch Telesur, because Telesur isn't produced by the capitalist ruling class and the imperial core. It's in Venezuela, and they have a very different position on a lot of things. Prensa Latina is another good example coming out of Cuba. There are lots of other, or Newsclick, right, in India. There are lots of other examples that we could look to, and I think it's important to both support those platforms, learn from them, get plugged into collaborating with them in various ways, because we can't do this individually. It's not me writing a book or you doing, a few interviews and things like this that is going to change the world. Hopefully it'll be a contribution, a piecemeal contribution to it, but ultimately we need to work collectively, and we need to be focused on building infrastructure, right? Cultural producers can't just produce for themselves. We've got very limited time, right? If it be nuclear apocalypse or the ecological end of the world, we have very little time, and we need to get organized very quickly. We have to bring people on board, and we need serious political education. So to do that, we need infrastructure, and we need to do this collectively. We don't need showmen. We don't need people out hand waving. We need to work together and build up collective power in what is ultimately a kind of intellectual and cultural class struggle.
I think on that beautiful note of optimism of will, oh, Professor Rockhill, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me on, and keep up the great work.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.